Welcome back to the Liberty Perspective. I'm Joe Marshall. One of the first shows that I did was on the collectivism, on kind of showing, or exposing, if you will, if you want to use that word, the collectivism of the right, of the neoconservative NatCon right. I kind of got into a lot of different aspects of how collectivism has infiltrated the American right in politics. The populist nationalist right is just as collectivist as the communist anarchist left. It's just right-wing collectivism versus left-wing collectivism. Both have the same common enemy in our founding principles, in America's founding principles. Individual rights and liberty are natural, endowed by our Creator, unalienable rights and liberty. And what I mean by unalienable is what's in our Declaration of Independence. Unalienable rights. Human rights declaration, it's inalienable. Inalienable means they can't be separated from. Can't be separated from what? The social contract of collectivism? I don't know. But in our Declaration of Independence, our founding principles, the self-evident truths of our founding principles is that we have an inherent, unalienable, natural individual rights and liberty, which is there can be no lien put on them. There's no social contract lien. The only social contract in the context of our founding principles and founding constitutional republic is the lien placed on government, the powers, the limited powers placed on government to, ensure, preserve, protect, and secure the liberty of its people. It's been flipped on its ear with the inalienable rights of human rights, where it's the people's rights that become limited according to the responsibilities of social contract theory, of collectivist social contract theory. Anyways, that whole collectivism is kind of what's infiltrated the right as well. I mean, there's people on the right, and I've talked to people on icons on the right who say human rights and our individual rights and natural founding principles are the same. It's consistent with. I don't see how you can see that unless you've been indoctrinated into the progressivism of the collectivism, the progressive collectivism of human rights. You've been sucked into the abyss of the dialectal between what our actual individual rights and liberty are and the full-blown world socialism of human rights are. And in the abyss of that dialectal, truth is always in the middle. It's always in the middle. It's always in the middle. So you compromise and go to the middle, and there's still a middle between that middle and whatever thesis or antithesis that whatever, right? The synthesis is always unobtainable because no matter where you compromise on the end, it's again in the middle. It's again in the middle. And that's how you convolute truth. That's how you make truth actually unobtainable. That's what collectivism does. Collectivism is the anti-truth, if ever there was one, according to its own doctrine. I mean, look at the Communist Manifesto. Communism abolishes all eternal truth, absolute truth. Can there be a concept of an absolute and eternal truth without the concept of God? I don't know. But anyways, I want to kind of expand on that earlier show that I did on the, kind of deciphering the collectivism of the right, of the American right in politics. And I gotta, but the reason why I wanted to expand on this too is because it's pertinent to contemporary, I don't know what's going on, with the whole medical freedom movement. It's a fake medical freedom movement. The evidence is becoming exponentially clearer to the fact that we have a full-blown collectivist, progressive collectivist, leftist progressivist collectivist right in the medical freedom movement. Somehow, the populist nationalist right is just loaded with leftist progressives. They're not former leftist progressives. They're the same leftist progressives espousing, quote unquote, themselves as, or putting themselves out as, populist nationalist right, hooking up with actual long-time populist nationalist right, like Steve Bannon, right? Hooking up with these people that have always been, and they have targeted our founding principles, our founding republic, with its limited constitution, limiting the powers of government, as Alexander gets into in Federalist 78. Limited constitution. But they have targeted these things as much for destruction as the anarchist communist left have targeted it for destruction, right? Humanist, whatever, collectivist left, right? Because the nationalists, the government can't be limited, the nation can't be limited, as our Constitution limits governments today. They're just as collectivist, so they need decentralization and power. But what I got today is I got a couple of things I want to show you and go over a little bit, just so that we can go back. And what I've got, see that. Probably get up here a little bit. I'm going to be going down through some stuff here, but at the same time, I got a video that I want to show you. This goes back to 2019, right before the pandemic. A little bit of history going on here. This guy, Yoram Hazony, not exactly sure how you pronounce it, but he put out a video. He did this. He's one of the guys that put together the first National Conservative Conference. First National Conservative Conference in the U.S. They've been going on all over Europe, a few places in Europe and stuff. It's part of a geopolitical movement, and that's the other thing that I'm going to show you. This is all part of a geopolitical movement. It's not just in America, and it's being pushed by guys like Steve Bannon and Alexander Dugin, who, by the way, I'm going to show you. At least they consider themselves ideological soulmates, or at least Dugin considers Bannon to be his ideological soulmate. It's crazy. Alexander Dugin, the guy they call Putin's brain, right? Putin's Rasputin or whatever. But I'm going to get into this, and this is the other thing that I want to show you, is how this whole medical freedom movement, the far left, all of a sudden now national populist right medical freedom movement is following a long lineage of full-blown communists, even Trotskyists, new left Trotskyists, communists, fighting against each other, splitting off in what they called the new right, and then you had a whole bunch of different stuff. The Weather Underground in the 1960s split off of that. Bill Ayers, Bernardine Dorn, those guys. Yeah, the domestic terrorist organization, they split off the new left. LaRoche cult split off the freaking new left. So that's, all those Matt Ert and all these other guys that are all out pushing all this weird, LaRochian, I don't know, the same Trotskyist communist origins as, the neocons, the neoconservatives, who now these national conservatives, even though with the support, and they're being sponsored, the event is being sponsored by, neocon icons. So now they have a combined, they're combining, they're with some of the neocons, they're separating themselves from the neocons, but they all, the new right and far left, all have the same far left progressive collectivist even communist DNA are as much on the right as it is on the left today. And these are kind of some of the things that I'm going to be showing you. And that constant push coming from all these different leftist organizations over the years. I mean, the 50s and 60s and 70s when the left became the right. So the medical freedom movement isn't doing anything new. It's the same old from the revolutionary collectivist handbook, right? There's a constant wellspring of leftist, I can't even say leftist, of collectivist, progressive collectivist mindset, ideology, doctrine being pumped up into the whole of American society. Constantly renewing itself as the right. Constantly renewing itself as the right. And what that does is it leaves a limited spectrum of debate in American politics, eliminating the debate between our founding principles and collectivism, and making it a debate between left-wing collectivism and right-wing collectivism. Either way, collectivism wins and our founding principles lose. That's where we are. And that's kind of where I want to get at here. And I want to show you this, listen to this guy and kind of listen to a little bit of this video. Most of this video we're going to listen to. So I'm going to stop and point some things out and consider what he's actually saying. And listen to the words that he's saying so that we can understand what he's actually saying. This was back in 2019, okay? Right before the epidemic, COVID, right?
Day in college, I was busy founding a Reaganite magazine on my college campus, the Princeton Tory, which is still publishing today. And in and in those days, I believed that I had a very clear understanding of what political conservatism was. I mean, I was, 19 years old, but I believed I had a very clear understanding of what political conservatism was. The Tory was supported by Irving Kristol's Institute for Educational Affairs. And by the way, I'm extremely pleased to have the Public Interest, Irving Kristol's magazine, which he founded, as a sponsor of this conference.
Irving Kristol, one of the founding fathers in neoconservatism, as a sponsor of this.
But Irving Kristol, there's a little bit of optical illusions here. Irving Kristol was known as the great neoconservative. And yet, the word neoconservative in those days didn't mean anything like what the word neoconservative means today. In fact, it almost meant the opposite. When we learned to be conservatives under the aegis of Irving's institution, what we were learning was that modern conservatism was a movement that was founded on 3 pillars. This is Irving. Modern conservatism is founded on 3 pillars: religion, nationalism, and economic growth. And in Irving's view, religion of the 3 was the most important, because it was only religion that could provide the framework for a decent life that would allow economic growth and nationalism to be kept in check and in balance.
One of the things the founders of neoliberalism and a lot of these the guys, Burke, they refer to religion as the opium of the people. You got to have something out there. Hitler kind of wrote about the same kind of thing in his Mein Kampf. That, they got to have something that they want to. And Walter Rauschenbusch actually wrote about the same thing in his Christianizing the Social Order. They got to have something to live and die for, to believe in and live and die for. So you give them the opium of religion to, use as leverage to stir them up. Just pointing that out.
That was the old neoconservatism. That was the conservatism that I was brought into a long, long time ago, before the word meant something entirely different. And I loved that American conservative movement in the...
Yeah, the old neoconservatism that wasn't the original neoconservatism with its DNA rooted in Trotskyism, right? The new left Trotskyism. He doesn't point that part out, you know.
Those days. And I felt these are people who think like I do, and this is my place. But something went terribly wrong with American conservatism after the fall of the Berlin Wall in November 1989, exactly 30 years ago. Within a year after this momentous event, American and British conservatism was awash with fantastic nonsense about the end of history having arrived. Within a year, the Tories had dumped Margaret Thatcher for insisting on British nationalism, on British national independence, and opposing the submersion of her nation into the European Union. Within a year, George H.W. Bush was speaking in utopian terms about a new world order in which the law of the jungle would be replaced by the rule of law everywhere on earth. A new world order. I remember those words as if it were yesterday. I first heard them on the radio. I remember the chill that raced down my spine. And
people defending our founding principles were just as shocked by that whole new world order thing too, right? But that's not the perspective that he's concerned. He's not concerned. As a matter of fact, have you heard it? We haven't yet heard him mention anything to do with our founding principles at all yet.
I said, can this really be happening? I thought, isn't that exactly what the Americans fought World War II and the Cold War in order to avoid? Utopian thinking swept the political right in the United States and in the UK and in Europe. And we have to understand this. It ruined everything it touched. In 1992, these conservatives, in many cases we should without flinching say former conservatives, they cheered the declaration of a
the former conservatives who were former Trotskyite communists, right?
European Union to erase the nationalities of Europe. In 1993, they enthusiastically greeted the Oslo Accords, fueled by the fantasy of a new borderless Middle East. In 1997, they were all too happy to hand Hong Kong over to the Chinese and to bring China, the first step to bringing China into the World Trade Organization in their breathless excitement over the imminent liberalization and democratization of China. For those of you who are too young to remember it, let me make the point simply. In the 1990s, the conservative movement was drunk with the feeling of power as a result of the victory over communism. And people who are drunk with power lose touch of reality. And these conservatives, in particular, forgot anything that they had ever known about how to conserve anything. They lost all interest in Edmund Burke and in traditionalism. They lost all interest in the details of the Anglo-American political inheritance.
Burke and traditionalism. I've got something here. You see, I got Burke. I've got. Come back here for a second. Okay. Got something I want to show you on Burke. I don't know if you can read all that or not. It says Edmund Burke. He was a British guy, wasn't he? I think he was a British guy. Yeah. Burkean foundations. Well, anyways, I wanted to kind of read this to you. Basically, He defended the American Constitution, which he believes was justified defense of traditional liberties of Englishmen and limited government. Burke's conservatism was not an abstract doctrine. It represented the particular conservatism of unwritten British Constitution. In the politics of his time, Burke was a Whig, and he bequeathed to later conservative thinkers the Whig belief in limited government. Right. This belief was partly why Burke defended the American Revolution. But Burke shocked his contemporaries by insisting that with brutal frankness that the illusion and prejudice are socially necessary. He believed that most human beings are innately depraved, steeped in original sin, and unable to better themselves with their feeble reason. This is to a point. Better, he said, to rely on the latent wisdom of prejudice, which accumulates slowly through the years, than to put men to live and trade each on his own private stock of reason, which means you can't let people be left to their own, recognizances, right? Among such prejudices are those that favor an established church, so a state church, like the Church of England, which we once separated ourselves from it in the Revolutionary War. This is the Burkean thing that he's saying that, conservatives need to be more aligned with, right? So, yeah, he said, among these prejudices are in favor of an established church and a landed aristocracy. Members of the latter, according to Burke, are the great oaks and proper chieftains of society, provided that they temper their rule with a spirit of timely reform and remain within the constitutional frameworks. So basically what we're dealing with here is he wants, this whole Burkean thing here is that he wants, national control over what the people decide to do. You can't let the free enterprise of people and their own reasons be left to the people's cognizance. They need to be guided by an elite set of people who know better, right? The great oaks or whatever. But I just wanted to point that out about Burke here.
Except he lost all interest in the details of the Anglo-American political inheritance, except for a few particular lines that they keep quoting over and over again as their universal dogma. But the span of the tradition, they lost interest in it. They lost interest in the Bible, in Christianity and Judaism. Neither nationalism nor religion had any hold on them any longer. All that interested them was economic liberalism and the rights of the free and equal individual. In other words, was economic liberalism and the rights longer. All that interested them was economic liberalism and the rights of the free and equal individual. In other words, they became, instead of conservatives, they became a revolutionary movement, declaring universal liberal empire to be the world historical purpose of the American nation since its founding, and they set out on a mission to uproot all opposition to it, whether abroad or at home. For a generation, we've watched as conservatives wasted their energies, their political capital, their financial resources, all this in addition to the lives of hundreds of thousands of servicemen and civilians, all this in the vain, prideful, foolish, and ultimately fatal conceit that their very own minds had unlocked the secret to bringing perpetual peace and prosperity to every corner of the earth. And now we live among the wreckage brought about by that fatal conceit. A generation later, and America has, with its own hands, built up China as a genuine rival and a threat and a menace. A generation later, and much of the Middle East has been set to torch by America's own hand, yet with nothing to show for it but humiliation. A generation later, and America's industrial heartland has been shuttered and its factories closed and rusting. A generation later, and the country has been flooded with porn and with drugs. A generation later, and America's economic leadership has been given over to juvenile John Lennon clones who openly aspire to expend their corrupt, witless rule over all of mankind. A generation later, and America has abandoned any thought of being able to balance its budget or to pay its debts. Hey, why not? They're young people in the room. Let's stiff them with the bill. A generation later, and America's borders, like the borders of Europe, have been effectively dissolved. A generation later, and America's leaders and institutions of learning have determined that only Marxism and libertarianism are legitimate worldviews to teach, and that no conservative scholar will ever be hired again to a tenured position. A generation later, and Christianity, the force that did create this nation, is freely falling as it fell in Europe. A generation later, and this noxious brew of bad political philosophy, social disintegration, and surpassing arrogance is what American conservatives have been marketing to the rest of the world as something that the rest of the world should want to imitate and implement in their own countries too. And this is called conservatism. This is depressing. It's been depressing to watch it unfold, but I want to tell you, today I feel good. I do. Today I feel good. I feel good, and I feel good because I know that today is our Independence Day.
Listen carefully to what he says next.
Today we declare independence from neoconservatism. We declare independence from neoliberalism, from libertarianism, from what they call classical liberalism. You can give it any name you want, but that set of ideas that sees the atomic individual, the free and equal individual, as the only thing that an educated person needs to know about politics, and if he or she knows the free and equal individual, then he or she has the ability to set out and rule the world. That worldview, we're declaring independence from it today.
Neoliberalism is a word used throughout collectivist doctrine, both right and left, communist, nationalist, both. And what it refers to as is basically capitalism. Free enterprise is what they're dirting. Laissez-faire capitalism is what they're dirting, what they're shitting on. The free exchange of property owned for property desired, which is the fundamental principle of individual liberty, of it's the only earthly means to the possibility of a pursuit of an independent happiness. It's the private property necessary for that to even be a possibility. And what they're doing is he's shitting on neoliberalism, declaring his independence as he listed as one of the things he's declaring their independence from. That neoliberalism is actually, I've gone about over this in my shows before too, that neoliberalism itself that everybody says is the detested laissez-faire, the detested free enterprise, detested, free market capitalism, is actually a progressively compromised form of laissez-faire, because neoliberalism came out of a process. Walter Lippmann led a whole thing on that, and I went over that in one of my shows. I think it was Deciphering the Collectivism of one of Matthias Desmond's whole psychology of totalitarianism is based on Hannah Arendt, Hegelian, Marxist doctrine. So But then they get into the difference between, because they're constantly shitting on neoliberalism. So what is neoliberalism? You know, it's again, it's another one of those limited spectrum of debates things. So if you're fighting for actual free enterprise, for actual freedom of the individual, you want to fight for that free market enterprise, that capitalist free market capitalism. You want, that's what you need, what enables your whole possibility of an individual freedom. But once they put a compromise, a progressively compromised idea of that, then you've already sacrificed that idea and you compromise to whatever degree. Again, the truth is in the middle. The truth is in the middle, right? It's that whole dialectal shit. So they get you to throw it away piecemeal, and then instead of fighting for your actual freedom and liberty, you're fighting for the progressively compromised redefinition of what that free enterprise was. And that's what neoliberalism actually is. The founding of the term neoliberalism came out of that progressive compromise. But today, everybody just hears neoliberalism, and you hear free market, free enterprise, free market capitalism. But they know it to be these, doctrinaire progressives, right and left. They know what they're saying.
Now, we have at this conference almost declaring an ability to set out and rule the world. That worldview, we're declaring independence from it today.
I want you to hear this again.
Now, we have at this conference almost 50 speakers, and we're not going to have it that individual about politics, equal individual, of ideal classes from neoliberalism, neoconservatism. Today, we declare independence from neoconservatism. We declare independence from neoliberalism, from libertarianism, from what they call classical liberalism. You can give it any name you want, but that set of ideas that sees the atomic individual, the free and equal individual, as the only thing that an educated person needs to know about politics, and if he or she knows the free and equal individual, then he or she has the ability to set out and rule the world. That worldview, we're declaring independence from it.
They're declaring their independence from the concept of individualism, from the concept of free and enterprising individual, the autonomous individual. The religion they refer to is not a religion that, from a nationalist perspective, is not a religion that you should willy-nilly be able to go out and participate freely. They want an established Burkean national religion, right? The premise is on the collective, only this time the collective isn't a global communism foundation. It's a nationalist nation premise. It's the only difference.
Today. Now, we have at this conference almost 50 speakers, and we're not going to agree on many different things, not today and not into the future. We'll have many arguments, and they're going to be exciting. But the crucial thing is that there are things that unite everybody or almost everybody in this room. And what unites us is that we are national conservatives. All right, so which means to begin with that we're united in rejecting the idea that universal liberal empire can be or is the end and aim of conservatism. All right? That means that when we look to our left, we see people who see the world in terms of individualism, in terms of individuals.
So individualism and seeing our founding principles and our liberties in terms of autonomous individuals, the sanctity and integrity of the individual. That's what they're divorcing themselves from, to the collectivism of nationalism, rejecting the individualism of our individual rights and liberty, our founding principles, to embrace the collectivism of nationalism.
In terms of individualism, in terms of individual, we see people. That means that when we look to our left, we see people who see the world in terms of individualism, in terms of individuals. In other words, they see the world through the lens of the discipline of economics, right? When you study economics in college, they teach you to see, the choosing individual, the free individual, the rational individual, right? That's the foundation of economics. And that political worldview, that libertarianism or neoconservatism to our left, what it essentially does is it's the invasion of politics, the invasion of thinking realistically about politics by economics. It seeks to reduce political phenomena to economic theory. Right? That's what it does. That's that entire school that's dominated the Republican Party and a large part of the Democratic Party. All it wants to do is to reduce every political phenomenon to some kind of economic theory of the free, equal choosing individual. But the real political world does not consist of those atomic, free, choosing individuals. The real
atomic individuals, atomic, free choosing individuals. This is where we go back. He's using the same slave speak as Matthias Desmet, as Anna Hardin, as Marx, as Hegel. The atomization of the individual, the alienation of the individual. Capitalism represents capitalist societies. We don't have a collectivist society. And Matthias Desmet says the loneliness of the atomized, alienated individual is what's causing this mass formation. That, as Anna Hardin points out, and he points out that Anna Hardin points out, is the source of all totalitarianism hitherto known to man, including Stalin and Hitler. The individualism of capitalism, thus, is in collectivist doctrine, nationalist and communist both, right? Is the autonomous individual, the free and enterprising individual, leads to the loneliness, atomization, alienation of the individual. And I point this out in that show I did. And he's saying the same thing, and he's a conservative, right?
real political world is one of real political world does not consist of those atomic, free, choosing individuals. The real political world is one of competing tribes and nations. It's the real existence of tribes and nations that generates political phenomena such as national borders, independent national governments, national traditions, national cohesion, and national dissolution. Imagine if you see the world through that libertarian lens, through that economistic lens, you cannot understand what a border is for. You can't see cohesion and dissolution.
That's bullshit.
You can't see nations. You're completely blind to the central political phenomena that are taking place in the world. That is.
So if you're a follower of our founding or a proponent of our founding principles, if you're a proponent of our limited constitution, if you're a proponent of individual rights and liberties secured in there and the free society secured in there, then you can't see nations. What was America if not a nation? Just because America was founded as a nation doesn't mean nationalists founded it. Our founders weren't nationalists. They didn't want a national religion. The Church of England was one of the reasons why. It was an enumerated reason why we wanted our independence from England. Right?
In fact, the clash between the elites and the broad public is that the broad public has a traditional view of what the political world looks like, and they listen to the elites that have been trained in university and say, you're completely blind. you don't see anything. Without a clear awareness of what these things are, these truly...
So we're going to need to be told what these things are. So we need to be clear on what these things are.
Empirical political phenomena, your political program is going to be plagued with blindness to political reality. And I think that that's exactly what we've seen for 30 years. That our leaders trying to reduce, struggling to reduce, unable to see nations, their cohesion and their dissolution, unable to see tribes, unable to see the reality of real political things, living in a fantasy world in which everyone is an atomic choosing individual, rational. They create one blunder after another, one idiotic policy after another, because they don't know what human beings are. They're not interested in learning about reality. Now, I'm describing what's to our left. Let me talk for a moment.
He was describing what's to his left. Not the communism, not the anarchism, but the individualism.
About what's to our right. There is something to our right, and I don't want to underestimate it. Many friends of mine in the conservative movement like to say, white nationalists, that's just a tiny periphery. Okay, and it is still a tiny periphery. But if you think it's just a tiny periphery, you're looking in the wrong place. If you look at the young people, look at people in their 20s and 30s, look at people online, look at those kids. What are they reading? What are they talking about? Who are they watching? And I'm telling you that there is a very powerful movement in this country and in other countries that says this universal liberalism is completely detached from reality, and they seek reality in the lessons of population genetics and evolutionary biology, which is being applied systematically by scholars, right? Both real scholars at Harvard and other institutions who are studying these things, and all sorts of bogus scholars online. But they have their expertise, their encyclopedic knowledge, their worldview that they are building, which many young people are buying, whose influence grows rapidly with every single day. And this is a view that says that the reality is not the atomic individual who freely chooses. The reality is the reality of genetics and race, which determines all. Now, it is scary to hear that such a thing has planted itself in the United States. God willing.
Identity politics of the left. Identity politics of the left is a common reference from people on the right? Conservatives. But the identity politics is, where they just identify different collectives of oppressed versus the oppressor, which is, of course, the society targeted for destruction by the revolution, in this case, America. And Western free world at that, right? So, but that's what they refer to as identity politics, by race, by ethnics, by gender, by whatever category of oppressed or marginalized you are. The Weather Underground referred to them as America's interior colonies versus the imperialism, or capitalist imperialism, which are basically capitalism is domestic, imperialism is the globalization throughout the world, which is a global capitalism is imperialism. There goes Mini P. What's up over there, P? Anyways, so this whole hang on a second.
It will hear that such a thing has planted itself.
Oh.
It is scary.
The identity politics of the left, and on the right, he's talking about. We have to admit that it's there. It's called identitarian politics. So on the left has its identity politics. The progressive collectivist right, the nationalist populist right, has what they refer to as identity politics. The skinheads, and then they get into paleo conservatism. Blood and soil kind of stuff. Where what was the other one? Yeah, paleo, blood and soil. But anyways, this is the whole identitarian thing, white supremacists, all of that comes from that identitarian politics, which he's kind of saying is part and parcel to the nationalist right.
To hear that such a thing has planted itself in the United States, God willing, it will stay small. But at the moment, it's not staying small. At the moment, it's growing quickly. Okay, and this insanity is actually kind of a mirror image of the insanity of the libertarians. Because just as the libertarians want to take economic theory, which is perfectly useful in its own sphere, and invade politics and turn politics into economics, these people want to take genetics and...
Libertarians is such a loose, large, wide subject that I even don't know not exactly sure what he's referring to when he refers to libertarians. Because you could be a full-blown anarchist or libertarian socialist, and they're all still libertarians, so I don't know.
And biology, and invade politics, and have biology take over politics, turning all of us into robots that are controlled by our birth and by our race and by our genes. Now, both of these are apolitical. I mean, they get involved in politics, but they create fantasy worlds. Both of these theories refuse to pay attention, refuse to attend to the reality. What's the reality? The reality is that human beings, there's an autonomous political realm in which human beings live. And the number one factor, the number one thing to be considered about that realm is that human beings are sticky, that we stick, that we form into families and clans and tribes and
just a garbage man, Pete.
Nations and families of nations. And
we're sticky. We stick to each other. We naturally form collectives. Is this a way that he says that we naturally strive to be collectivist? That's what I'm getting.
Churches and schools and all sorts of other institutions. The race theorists would have us believe it's all determined by birth, but it isn't all determined by birth. Just look, if you've served in the army, if you've been in the service, you know that you join a platoon and no one in the platoon was born together with you. Right? There's no genetic commonality among the men who serve in the platoon, but they come under fire, they come under duress, and there is no one who is closer to you, who establishes ties of mutual loyalty, bonds that last the rest of your life, than someone who is protecting your back when you were on the battlefield. Right? But you don't even need to be on the battlefield to see that human beings don't only stick to people of their genetic kind. It's absurd. Human beings, I know human beings who stick. I know someone who wouldn't come to this conference because he's loyal to a pair of puppies that he rescued from the horrors of puppydom, and puppies in Dallas right now. The human beings have this cracked ability to develop mutual loyalty with dogs and with horses. And you can't tell me that that's fake, and you can't tell me that it's because of the genetic proximity of this individual and his two puppies. Okay. Now, we have a genetic inheritance, and we have a cultural inheritance. And that cultural inheritance allows us, under different circumstances, to merge and to join and to bring together and to adopt. Families can adopt. Clans can adopt. Tribes can adopt. Nations can adopt. We've seen it countless times in history. So if it's not the freely choosing individual that creates nations, and if not genetics, then what creates nations? Well,
freely choosing individuals. Who in our founding generation that fought our Revolutionary War and in all those years that led up to the Revolutionary War, who among them was not a free and choosing individual as far as pushing forth the idea of America? Something to think about there.
Well, there is this one thing that creates nations, this one thing that we need to focus on, although they don't teach it in political theory in university. All right, and that is the ties of mutual loyalty that human beings create, the bonds of mutual loyalty that are what allow us to sacrifice for one another, to serve one another, to serve together, to serve causes greater than ourselves, and even to sacrifice our lives. It's these bonds of mutual loyalty. And a nation is, even to serve loyalty that human beings create, the bonds of mutual loyalty.
The definition of what nationalism is.
Loyalty that are what allow us to sacrifice for one another, to serve one another, to serve together, to serve causes greater than ourselves, and even to sacrifice our lives. It's these
serve causes greater than ourselves, the nation, the collective, to even live and die for. That's the same shit Hitler said in Mein Kampf. The same shit. The same shit Walter Rauschenbusch said in his Christianizing the Social Order back in 1912. Right? 25 or 30 years before Hitler. No, my math is on by a while, right?
Bonds of mutual loyalty. And a nation is, as was said, a nation is that kind of love. It is these bonds of mutual loyalty. Now, if we're going to talk about a politics that is focused not on the individual and not on race, but on the nation, right? And that's what we're doing here. That is what we're doing here. We're creating a space in which the individual will continue to be very important and race will continue to have some kind of relevance. But the central question in politics is going to return to be, as it used to be a generation ago, is going to return to be the idea of the nation. As Rusty said, this is the way that the Bible thinks about politics, is in terms of nations.
The Bible it's not the individual in the Bible. It thinks in terms of nations. Are you shitting me? So we don't each have our own individual soul that we alone are responsible for, and that no other person can save us to get us into eternity, and we can't save anybody else. We're responsible for our own soul. The Bible doesn't think in terms of the individual. I don't know, man. Just pointing that out.
This is the way that the idea of the nation, as Rusty said, this is the way that the Bible thinks about politics, is in terms of nations. If we're going to return to the idea of a nation, we need to return, in fact, to three principles. First, national independence. Second, national cohesion. And third, national traditions.
I'm not saying that you can't have traditions or a whole society made by free and enterprising individuals, which our original founding republic was, right? Hear that again.
National independence. Second, national cohesion. And third, national traditions.
Cohesion and traditions. We can have cohesion It could be mutual beneficial for a society of individuals to want to protect the individual liberty and freedom of all, of everybody, of each other. But that's not what he's talking about. He's talking about top down. We need cohesion. We're going to establish a religion. We're going to establish what our traditions are. We're going to establish. And how does that happen without coercion? Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a free society for the individual.
National independence is the principle that says the world is governed best when the world is divided up among many different nations. They have borders they're divided by borders, and each one has within its borders its own laws, its own traditions, its own way of doing things, and it leaves the others alone. Now, that's not a utopia. We're not going to be able to implement tomorrow. It's not a blueprint, it's a hope. But it can also be a guiding principle for us to orient ourselves, to understand what our politics is about. If every nation has its own way of doing things, its own traditions and its own laws, so our job is not to be the world's policeman. Our job is not to teach the Afghanis how to run their country. If they want to come and visit our country and learn from us, then of course we can be a light unto the nations. Come learn from us. That's the ancient biblical vision of Israel. Right? God gives Israel the Torah, and the Torah is supposed to be for all the nations of the world. But God then gives Israel borders. He doesn't say, go out and conquer all the nations of the world. He says, you stay behind your borders, and when they're ready, they'll come. Right? That's the ideal of national independence, that our people we want to determine our fate. We want others to leave us alone, and we'll leave them alone. Not because we don't care, but because that's the best way to care. Let us develop our experiment. Let us develop our ways. If we are right that our ways are the best, others will imitate us. And if we fail and if we're wrong, let us fail as a free people, and then we'll imitate others in order to fix things. That's the principle of national independence. The second principle of national cohesion. Now, I know Chris mentioned earlier that there's some interpretations of this word that are a little bit scary. I'm using this word the way that it's used by the philosophers John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick.
John Stuart Mill and Henry Sidgwick.
All right, you can wave these names around with liberals. I'm sure that they're at the farthest possible right of academia today, John Stuart Mill, but you can still use them. They're still permissible for at least another few more years. And when Mill talks about cohesion, he's talking about this mutual loyalty that we talked about before. He's observing an empirical fact. Nations come together and feel unity. They feel unity and mutual loyalty and an ability to rise up against challenges. They feel that. It's real. It allows them to do incredible things, like, for example, having a democracy. Only a cohesive country can have a democracy. Why? Because if the country isn't strongly mutually loyal, if it's not strongly cohesive, then when one side wins the election, then the other side will refuse to hand power to them.
No, he's referring to the nation as a democracy, talking about how a nation needs, the only way we can have a democracy was national cohesion. Not our founding republic. He's not referencing that here.
They'll have a resistance. They'll fight them. They'll say they're illegitimate. They'll say, well, we didn't mean that when we said, democracy. Right? We meant more people like us would take over. That's democracy. If you don't have cohesion, you will not have democracy. Because
Is he talking about how Bannon and Trump are the populist nationalist right is now talking about Trump's going to be president again in 28 or whatever the next election is, right? And they're just gonna, I don't know, what are they gonna do? Stack the courts, the Supreme Courts, with 15 or whatever it takes Supreme Court justices that'll say it's constitutional, like FDR did back in the New Deal, right? Is that what he's talking about?
No one's going to hand power to anybody else. Right? So clocking, paying attention to what causes cohesion, what brings it about, and where is it fraying? And I have to tell you that in my life, I've never seen the cohesion of America as frayed as it is today. So you can't tell me cohesion isn't a real thing. Because if fraying is a real thing, then fraying is the opposite of cohesion. It's America falling apart. If it goes far enough, then there won't be changes of power democratically anymore. If it goes far apart, God forbid, then there'll be civil war. So cohesion is the most important thing to be thinking about right now. And so when we come to look at a policy like immigration, right, I'm not that interested. I mean, I understand that there are economic arguments, and they're good, interesting economic arguments about who should be, how many new immigrants there should be. But honestly, it doesn't make a darn bit of difference what the economic arguments are if the country is fraying so badly, if the cohesion is so shot that adding more immigrants is going to literally have some common sense. First things first. You can't give away your national independence, and you can't give away your national cohesion. You have to care for those things. You don't care for those things, then you won't have any rights, and you won't have any freedoms, and you won't have anything that's good for you, and you also won't have economic success.
So if it wasn't for the nation, you would have nothing, which is no different than Rousseau's social contract, which is no different than Hobbes' great Leviathan social contract, right? Where if it wasn't for the collective, if it wasn't for society at large, you would have nothing. Because it's human laws, society with its laws that force us to be free by making certain things in an otherwise a state of nature that would be of every man at war with every man, right? The state of nature before society existed as a state of war of every man against every man is how it's portrayed in collectivist social doctrine. And the state comes along and saves us. The collective comes along and saves us. City, state, nation, whatever. Where, and in that essence is where there's no laws, there's no right, there's no wrong, there's no moral, there's no immoral, there's no just, there's no unjust. This is an argument that goes back to Plato's Republic. This is what Plato's Republic was, a conversation on what is justice, what is just, how does it originate, And the laws in this state of nature of every man and at war with every man pre-exist human society, and human laws are what set us free by passing laws and forcing us to be free and forcing people to say, if you do this, this is wrong. And only with that force, that justice, that social justice, with the force of law, is there a just and an unjust? Is there a right and is there a wrong? You see what I'm saying? Where our founding principles are the opposite of that. And a state of nature is where natural law exists, where God's law exists, and there was a right, there was a right, there was a wrong. We had liberty, are naturally endowed by our Creator, liberty, unalienable. There could be no lien put on them. In the collectivist version, where we're forced to be free by human laws, there is a lien put on any liberties that we gain from our human rights, from human civil society origin, okay? There's a lien put on them in the social contract where, Auguste Comte wrote, the guy who founded sociology, the guy who founded the term altruism, right? That you can't speak of these collectivist rights, these society rights, without outside the context of the duties owed back to the collective in return, right? Rousseau said that if the prince says that you should die, or the whoever's in charge of the society or nation says that you should die because it's only upon the gift of that state that your life has even been possible, that anything that you have is possible. So you even your very life. So you owe even your very life to the state. That's collectivist social contract. There's a lien put on everything that is all rights and liberties that are of human or civil origin. In natural law, God's law, and the state of nature before society, as John Locke, that's the reason why collectivists hate the guy so much. He acknowledges God, collectivist doctrine. You can't propose or even introduce the concept of a collectivist society, of collectivism, of a collective society, without first presenting an argument against the very existence of God, which collectivist doctrine does with its state of nature being a war of every man against every man. There's no God, there's no God's law, right? It's just an understanding of where he's coming from when he says this thing, based on the doctrine that he's espousing, on the collectivism that he's espousing.
Then you won't have cohesion. You have to care for those things. You don't care for those things, then you won't have any rights, and you won't have any freedoms, and you won't have anything that's good for you, and you also won't have economic success. The third principle as nationalists that we should be concerned with after national independence and national cohesion, the third principle is national traditions. Okay, and tradition is a word that has almost evaporated.
Here's where we kind of go. He mentioned traditionalism earlier, and I didn't kind of capitalize on it, didn't actually show that to you, but he mentioned the word traditionalism, which nationalism, Steve Bannon, he's a, traditionalist. Alexander Dugin from Russia is a traditionalist based on the doctrines of other people before them, right?
From the American lexicon, along with honor, along with sanctity, and along with God and Scripture. These are things that 2 generations ago, they still were thick in the United States, and 1 generation ago, they still had some kind of presence, and now they've been stuffed into private corners of America where people bring them out because other people aren't looking. All right? And I can't tell you what a catastrophe this is, because a nation has to have things that hold it together, right? I described the psychological mechanism of mutual loyalty, right, of national cohesion. But you can't have cohesion over nothing. You have to have cohesion over something shared. It doesn't have to be a particular document or a particular philosophy. It's a tradition of things, a tradition of arguments that are our arguments, not somebody else's arguments. Okay, and America has been in the business now for 3 generations of uprooting every traditional concept that has made this country recognizable, would have to our ancestors and to our parents. I'm talking about God and Scripture. I'm talking about nation and family. I'm talking about man and woman. I'm talking about the sacred and the honorable. Every single one of these keystone concepts that held this nation together has come under attack, has been severely damaged, and in many cases overthrown. Okay, so I'm going to say something that I know that for many people is not the easiest thing to hear. In the 1960s, many conservatives went along with the idea that you could privatize religion. They thought...
Remember I told you about the national religion? Going back to Burke. You think I'm making this shit up? Listen to what he says.
You could just take along with the idea that you could privatize religion. They thought you could just take God and Scripture and put them in the private sphere, and it would be fine because we have innate, natural, universal reason which would allow us to continue to defend the family and the nation and its borders and reasonable immigration rates and the ability to pay back our national debt and on and on. We thought you could just stay reasonable having gotten rid of God and Scripture. And guess what? There's no shred of truth in this at all. We tried it. We did it. It turns out that it was God and Scripture that was holding in place the entire set of structures, not reason, tradition. You throw out Christianity and the Jewish contribution too with it, but basically in this country, Christianity, you throw out Christianity, you throw out the Torah, you throw out God, and within 2 generations, people can't tell the difference between a man and a woman. They can't.
All these things happen from privatized religion, remember.
They can't tell the difference between a foreigner and a citizen. They can't tell the difference between this side of the border and the other side of the border. They can't tell the difference between paying back your debts and simply borrowing forever. It doesn't matter. All these things are the same. It sloshes back and forth. The political fads, they come and they go with no anchor, with nothing to anchor them. Right? And the only way, if there is a way, the only way to save this country, to bring it back to cohesion, to bring it back to independence and health, the only way to do it is going to be to restore those traditions. Okay, so I understand that many people were raised atheists. It's not simple. But let's start with this. If you're not giving honor to the traditions of your grandparents and your great-grandparents, if you're not giving honor to God and Scripture, if you're not giving honor to those traditions, you have simply thrown the anchor away. And when somebody comes and tells you, you know, I just think that the world is going to be better off if America is ruled from Brussels, so it sounds funny now. It's not funny. That's what they teach in the universities.
Nationalism versus communism arguments here. It sounds conservative as long as he's arguing against the communist left, right? Doesn't mean he's fighting for our founding principle. It doesn't mean that he's fighting for the idea of America and our founding republic.
There has to be a return to national tradition, to the traditions of this nation. These are Anglo-American traditions of constitutionalism, the common law.
How do you throw constitutionalism in there?
The English language and the Christian religion, with a specific emphasis in England and America on the Old Testament. These are the traditional cultural inheritance of this people. These are the things around which unity and cohesion amid diversity was possible. E pluribus unum, the creation of unity out of diversity, was possible because of those things: English language, the common law and Anglo-American constitutional tradition, and Scripture, Christian Scripture. Those are the things. Now, it is a very steep climb to bring them back. Maybe it's impossible to do. But it doesn't change the fact that we need to know which way to go. We need to have a direction and to know what that direction is.
Why do we have to be a nationalist? Why do we have to be a nationalist collectivist for that to happen? Why do we have to have a nation telling us what these things are for that to happen? You know, it,
National conservatism is a direction for this country and for the UK and for other countries. It offers hope to end this perpetual revolution. And the hope that it offers is by restoring the healthy parts of the national traditions that we can still identify, we can still embrace, we can still give them honor. It's not too late, it's still possible. We can win this fight.
okay, I wanted you to see that. He mentions Jeremy Bentham in there. But I don't know if he mentions Jerry Bentham or not. I don't know. I can't remember why I had that there. But anyways, on traditionalism, I kind of wanted to touch on traditionalism and what traditionalism is in nationalist doctrine. There's this guy, Benjamin Teitelbaum. I mean, he's obviously a full-blown lefty, but the thing is when you're studying the conflict between leftist collectivism and right-wing so-called collectivism, between communism and nationalism, or world socialism and nationalism, however you want to put it, is that there's nobody that knows a nationalist better than a communist, and nobody knows communists better than nationalists. They're all the same collectivism. And a lot of these right-wing nationalist populists are rooted in the same DNA, the same communist Trotskyist DNA in many aspects, right? I wanted to get into this, read a little piece on this from this so that you can see. Hang on just a second. Get a little bit of a idea what this traditionalism is. And he writes, Trump ally Steve Bannon wants to destroy the U.S. society as we know it. New Lines magazine, of course, progressives are going to say that all this progressivism that we've had over all these years, we've become a progressive society. Now these conservatives want to undo that. So in essence, the progressives today are the new conservatives trying to conserve the progressivism that has been won over the past. It's kind of crazy, right? But anyways, this guy writes, to understand his thinking and actions, we can begin by looking into his past. Steve Bannon, right? Though he identifies as a nationalist or a populist, today he has spent far more of his adult life studying and participating in an alternative spirituality. Most notably, a little-known movement with the plain-sounding moniker traditionalism. Traditionalism and its teachings encompass both Bannon's noted Catholicism and the cultural conservatism, but it gnarls each, inspiring extreme opposition to modern institutions. It's a postmodern. It's postmodern, trying to reintroduce pre-modern. I don't know. But traditionalism account of a dark age, thus resembles right-wing populist criticisms of our own era, that sovereignty is stripped as our economies and states massify and spread, and that our institutions for establishing truth and order, schools, the media, and government, make up a thoroughly corrupt establishment from which little good can come. Yeah, for establishing truth and order. Institutions for establishing truth and order. Establishing truth? They establish the truth, right? I don't know. Where traditionalism spreads beyond populism, again, populism is a progressive concept, political concept that comes out of the progressive era, which is like the early 1800s to like even up until the 1970s. But populism is kind of a progressive concept put together for politics to skirt our republic, to skirt the firewalls of our republic. As I've explained before, our republic is set up like a submarine or a ship with the sections with firewalls. So if there's a fire or a leak in one section, you can close it off so it doesn't spread across. Our local governments, our town, village, city, town, county, state governments are all like those firewalls, where, like Madison speaks in Federalist 10 of these as factions, that threaten the liberty of the people. If there's a fire, if they start a fire, a revolutionary fire in one section, it kind of stays contained to that area locally because of the firewalls of our republic. Kind of, at least if it spreads slowly so that we can have time to reconsider, right? Where an open democracy, it would spread sea to shining sea a lot quicker if those firewalls weren't there. And that's the reason why collectivists, right and left, have always wanted a democracy, why they always advocate for democracy, why Marx advocated for a democracy. They all advocate for democracy. But that's where we're going here, where traditionalism spreads beyond populism. And populism is a progressive concept, just as hard collectivist is nationalism, designed to skirt the firewalls of our republic, designed to skirt our republic, and eventually deconstruct our republic. Where traditionalism spreads beyond populism, in part, is its focus on spirituality and its elaborate celebration of borders. Okay, populists may fetishize national borders and rigid gender identities as tokens of order, but traditionalism can inspire a deeper love of boundaries, going from celebration of social hierarchies within a society to condemnation of global economic systems. Evangelism and universal systems for establishing facts in a better society. According to them, men are distinct from women. Yeah, national borders are meaningful in different groups. Nations or casters have their own methods for establishing truth. He's a collectivist. Establishing truth, I guess, is universal between collectivisms. It would be a world of difference in all ways you can imagine. When traditionalism has entered politics, it has always done so within the radical right. Prior to Bannon and his contemporaries, the most notorious case of this was the Italian cultist, philosopher, and fascist collaborator Julius Evola. Where the communist left is always trying to associate the right with fascists and Hitler, right? The Nazis, and right or wrong, that's what they do. A little bit on what traditionalism is. It's but I kind of wanted to get down into this here. This Jeremy Betham, the Utilitarian Foundations of Collectivism, altogether. It kind of just is this article right here. Okay, but I'm not going to read the whole thing. But you can read it if you want to get into this a little bit more. I wanted to put this down here so you can get an idea where we're coming from in this split between, leftist collectivism and right-wing collectivism, and the difference that they both have from our individual liberty. While acknowledging that in any attempt to pigeonhole or classify Betham is bound to be particularly misleading, in any attempt at precise and concise generalization about his views and the role of the state especially hazardous. By concentrating primarily on the implications of his philosophical doctrine rather than what specific conclusions Bethel himself might have reached on any particular issue, one can see how the seeds of interventionist liberalism were sown. Interventionist liberalism. Early Victorian liberalism carrying on a tradition prevalent since the 17th century still held closely to a belief that the inalienable rights of man to life, liberty, and property, a doctrine closely connected with the writings of John Locke. I want to point something out here, too. This lady, well, I'll just keep reading for a second. Okay, this is life, liberty, and property is a doctrine closely connected to the writings of John Locke. Yes. Over time, this doctrine evolved into notions of the autonomous will of the individual and liberty defined as the absence of all unnecessary restraints, was lauded as a supreme value in the political discourse. This rugged individualism, naturally led to a distrust of the state and the most forms of government intervention. Progress would be ensured if the government removed restraints to trade and let individual enterprise flourish. These are basically our founding principles on what, where we came from, right? They call it early Victorian liberalism. Yeah, that's the other screwed up thing, right? Is that when socialists, and I write about this at the beginning of my book, and I've talked about this too in my other shows, is at one time, not too far long ago, socialists, as Frederick Hayek points out in his Road to Serfdom as well. At one time, when socialism became a bad moniker, became bad name that you didn't want to be referred to as a socialist, socialists started referring to themselves as progressives. Well, then progressivism, they finally figured out who progressives were, and when progressivism got a bad name for being the socialists that they actually were, they took on the name liberals, which had already been used by people that were on the libertarian, liberal, liberty people, pro-liberty, pro-libertarian, pro-liberty people were known as liberals before, was it like the 1960s and 70s maybe? They started calling themselves progressives, and then they started calling themselves liberals, to kind of convolute between an actual libertarian liberal was, and now a socialist, progressive, communistic, liberal was. So you've got opposite contending meanings of what a liberal is. So, not too long ago to say, the liberals, you got to own the libs, man. They're talking about the leftists, the lefties, right? The collectivists, the communists, the socialists. Own the libs. People, we can relate to that still somewhat. But socialists to progressives to liberals. And then, Hillary Clinton started calling themselves progressives again. And then you got Bernie Sanders, outright socialists again. So now socialism is cool again. They've kind of dropped the liberal thing. And now, although people on the right still call the people on the leftist progressives, still call them libs and liberals too, right? But if you go back and you read the Communist Manifesto, they refer to liberals or the liberal ideal, or you listen to, you read Hayek's Road to Serfdom, and there refers to liberals in there. You could read it in reverse if you aren't aware of how the evolution of the meaning of the word liberal has evolved full circle, by the work of the progressive collectivists, by the revolution, has convoluted that, maybe on purpose. I don't know. It wouldn't surprise me. But I just wanted to point that out too, because we get into this whole liberal thing, right? Early Victorian liberalism. So somebody today on the right might understand that as the leftist progressives, but they're referring to the freedom of the individual liberty, libertarian liberty people. So I'm saying, you could even understand this in reverse if you aren't aware of what he's actually saying here. So the early Victorian liberalism, Now listen to how he defines it. Carrying on a tradition of prevalent since the 17th century, still hold closely to a belief in the inalienable rights of man. Now, into life, liberty, and property, which was changed to the pursuit of happiness because they didn't want people fighting for property and calling slaves property. They didn't want to give that to the people that were trying to the slavers. They didn't want the slavers being able to use that to defend slavery. That's one of the reasons why they changed it to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness instead of property. A doctrine closely connected with the writings of John Locke. But them inalienable rights of men. Again, I've let me see what happens here. Something happened. I don't know. The AI on this thing, I don't know what it's doing, man. I just don't know what it's doing. I have no idea. The inalienable rights of man, as I was explaining to you earlier, in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, you look it up, it says inalienable rights. That's the human rights word being placed a lot of times by people that have gone through the progressive dip, the collectivist dip in academia. They've gone through the academic dip, okay, and they can't get away from that inalienable. But our Declaration of Independence is unalienable rights, okay. And unalienable means there can be no lien put on that, no social contract lien. Inalienable means they can't be separated from, but can't be separated from what? They can't be separated from the social contract duties owed, like Comte was saying, from a collectivist perspective. Very similar words. Way different in meaning. Unalienable versus inalienable, but here he's using inalienable. Over time, this doctrine evolved into notions of the autonomous will of the individual and liberty defined as the absence of unnecessary restraints. Was lauded as the supreme value of political discourse. This rugged individualism, they're saying the rugged individualism is Victorian liberalism. It's not collectivism. So you put rugged individualism and liberal together today in contemporary politics, you might have people saying, what? They're opposites. However, if most of the 19th century, sorry about that. This rugged individual naturally led to a distrust of the state and most forms of government intervention. Progress would be ensured if the governments removed restraints to trade and let individual enterprise flourish. However, if most of the 19th century can be considered as the golden era of laissez-faire, self-reliance, individual responsibility, and minimal government intervention in economic and social affairs, it is clear that by the end of the century, these ideas were in decline as popular ideology. Okay. In common character of political economy as a heartless ideology, the common character of political economy as heartless ideology concerned only with the atomistic, what did we just hear? Atomistic and economic individuals is the same shit that we just heard, right? Right? The common character from a progressive revolutionary standpoint, from the perspective of the collectivism, right? And revolution against our society, against America as founded. Yeah, the heartless ideology concerned only with the atomistic and economic individuals they considered too limiting as a description of the human condition. Furthermore, unregulated capitalism was condemned for the dehumanizing effect it was perceived to have and for breaking the traditional bonds that held society together as an organic whole. It disrupted the collective. The collective. It was atomistic. It was alienation and lonely individuals. For those with an aesthetic sensibility, capitalism was seen as the engine by which ugliness had replaced beauty. Okay? Unfortunately, some liberal thinkers responded to this criticism by conceding the argument over the perceived inadequacies of many liberalism's basic tendencies. So you have a lot of these pro-freedom, pro-liberty people today that are saying, oh yeah, capitalism is bad, man. You've adopted the collectivist perspective against it as your own. Yeah. Unfortunately, some liberal thinkers responded to this criticism by conceding the argument over the perceived inadequacies of many of liberalism's basic tenets. Perceived inadequacies, particularly those concerning the nature of individuality. Particularly those concerning the nature of individuality and the traditional way freedom was defined as merely the absence of constraints on individual action. T.H. Green played an important role in changing liberal assumptions by moving from a negative conception of freedom. Here's where we get into the positive rights versus negative rights. The negative rights means there's no government action that was needed for you to have them, which is our founding rights, our individual rights and liberty that were here before society was formed, versus the positive rights that require positive action, human action, civil action in order for them to create them out of nothing. Right? So, right? And they're talking about it here. They're bringing this up here. They're actually speaking to the difference between what a collective perspective on rights and an individual liberty perspective on rights are. Yep. T.H. Green played an important role in changing liberal assumptions by moving from a negative conception of freedom towards a more positive one. So this is on the right. This is on the pro-freedom people, the liberal side of things, even libertarian side of things, where they're kind of, bending to the collectivist accusation. He argued that freedom should be conceived in broader terms than that had been previously allowed. Moral and ethical considerations were now brought to bear so that the ideal of true freedom is the maximum of power for all members of human society, unlike to make the best of themselves. So instead of the individual, the collective becomes the needs of the many needs the needs or the rights of the few or the one. Yeah. A belief in the autonomy of the individual was discarded in favor of an organic notion of the individuals as a part of society and with corresponding obligations to it. Rather than restricting freedom, the state should now be used as a means to enhance it as well. That's where we are with this nationalism. Progressives on the right as much as the left now. The traditional liberal antithesis between the state and the individual, Green argues, should be discarded, particularly in an emerging democratic nation. He spoke in terms of democracy. He spoke in terms of Yoram Hazony, right? Or what was his name? I don't know. Yoram Hazony, right? He's the guy who put that whole National Conservative Conference together, by the way. Sponsored by Irving Kristol from the Neoconservatives, right? Yeah, the traditional liberal antithesis between the state and the individual, Green argues, should be discarded, particularly in an emerging democratic nation. What is clear is that the administrative revolution in government was an evolutionary process rather than an abrupt change. So much so that many did not realize it was happening. Many didn't realize it was happening. They didn't see it. They weren't grounded in the principles. In order to defend our rights, liberty, freedom, in our republic, you have to know what they are. You have to know what the fundamental principles of them are, and not just go with the redefinition of what they are as per the revolution targeting them for destruction, is what people are doing today. When you say, well, that rugged individualism, that pull yourself up by the bootstraps, as Obama used to say, you know, the progressive arguments against it. And the people that were on the so-called right or conservatives were bending to it. Not rooted in the principles themselves, you know. Relativism steps in, and things become relative to however the revolution defines them. Capitalism becomes relative to how the revolution against it defines them. Well, America becomes relative according to the revolution against them. The world socialism against it. The world collectivism against it. I mean, yeah, America's being shit on hard out there. Oh, the argument is, well, I mean, what is there really good about America to defend today? The aspects of America that are under assault in the geopolitical circles today are the result of the very same progressive collectivism that is targeted at for destruction and continues to destroy it. None of it has anything to do with our founding principles. Everything, all of it, every aspect of what America has become on an international stage that the world is the hegemony, that the whole BRICS and everything else is now coming up with their own version of them to compete against the hegemony of America, right, on the world stage. All those things, the Keynesian economics that put all these things into place, that gave us the fiat dollar and put the world on the American dollar, and gave the American government the power to extort people on the dollar standard, which is what they're doing. But none of that has anything to do with our founding principles, which is what I'm arguing for. So they're blaming the concept of America. Then you got guys out there like Matthew Urt who are going back and actually blaming it on our founding principles, switching our whole history, turning our whole history around according to the needs of the revolution against the whole concept of America. Even though what's the actual things that are being committed are from our progressive origin. Couple of things I'd like to point out there anyways. You don't hear anybody saying that. There's nobody defending America out there. I don't hear anybody. And then sometimes I wonder if I'm the only one left. I don't see anybody out there defending America's founding principles. I see people out there trying, which is good. There's hope. There's always hope, right? But anyways, what is clear is that the administrative revolution in government was an evolutionary process that was rather than an abrupt change. So much so that many did not realize it was happening. And it's still going on. It's still happening today. This was written... I have a date. I don't have a date. This was written 1994. That was written in this article was written in 1994, so it's not affected by contemporary politics. So we're getting a look at something that's kind of, rare these days. Going back and seeing something before the effects of contemporary politics on it. But this is where we are. Yeah, so much so that many did not realize it was happening. A few libertarian thinkers such as Herbert Spencer, Auburn Herbert, Wadsworth, Dennis Thorpe, William Mallock, and Thomas McKay, I really don't know who those guys are, were more perceptive than most in recognizing the underlying trend of social policy. Herbert Spencer despairingly referred to the new Toryism of the Liberal Party. Yet by the end of the century, the ideological tide had turned to such an extent that the growing state involvement was perceived as a generally beneficial process, and critics who bemoaned the new consensus were regarded as antiquated and out of touch. Yeah, you can't defend the actual thesis of the Overton window has moved away from the defense of our founding principles. And it's more in the synthesis area, in the dialectical. The argument is now caught in the abyss of the dialectal. Right? But that's how I'm perceived here. That's how people like me, I don't know how many others there are, but people like me defending the actual true individual rights and liberty of our founding and our founding principles and our founding republic are perceived as antiquated and out of touch. Yeah. So be it. So be it. At least to try to keep it alive, try to keep the argument alive so that if the torch, if somebody wants to pick up the torch, it's there and it doesn't get buried and lost to the history of course, according to the revolution that's targeted it all for destruction. This is what I'm trying to do with the liberty perspective, is just put these things out there, this mindset argument for and from the perspective of our individual rights and liberty are naturally endowed by our creator, unalienable individual rights and liberty versus the collectivism of every argument against them. However incrementally progressive they are. You know? No matter where in the dialectal they're coming from. Right. But Bentham was most notoriously difficult to read. Okay, this guy Bentham was very difficult to read, and that he produced no bestsellers during his lifetime is common knowledge. Nevertheless, it would appear that his ideas filtered through the general consensus via the writings of the and activities of a small number of dedicated and remarkably active advocates of his philosophical position. The writings of James Mill, John Stuart Mill, and other philosophical radicals. Many of Bethman's ideas reached a wide audience. Another guy that has spoke at that 1919 National Conservative Conference was J.D. Vance. And I got a little something for you. I got to go from 147 to 558. So just like 5 minutes here. Let's see if we can come up with this. See if this rings any bells.
Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? Mattered most to me. Now, that American dream is undoubtedly in decline, and I want to talk a little bit about why I think that's happening and what a conservative politics has to do in response. But I think a first and preliminary step is that we have to distinguish between a conservative politics and a libertarian politics. I don't mean to stand up here and criticize libertarianism. I first learned about conservatism as an idea from Friedrich Hayek. I think The Road to the Serfdom is one of the best books that I've ever read about conservative thought. But in an important way, I believe that conservatives have outsourced our economic and domestic policy thinking to libertarians. And because that's such a loaded word and because labels mean different things to different people, I want to define it as precisely as I can. So if you don't consider yourself a libertarian under this definition, I apologize, you can still use the label, but what I'm going after in my talk is this view that so long as public outcomes and social goods are produced by free individual choices, that we shouldn't be too concerned about what those goods ultimately produce. For example, in Silicon Valley, it is common for neuroscientists to make much more at technology companies like Apple and Facebook, where I think they quite literally are making ultimate individual choices that and social goods are produced. You that so long as public outcomes and social goods are produced by free individual choices, that we shouldn't be too concerned about what those goods ultimately produce. For example, in Silicon Valley, it is common for neuroscientists to make much more at technology companies like Apple and Facebook, where I think they quite literally are making money addicting our children to devices and applications that warp their brain. They will make more money than neuroscientists who are trying to cure.
Remember, this is all stemming from individual choices. The freedom people get to choose, freedom, individual choices.
Cure Alzheimer's. And I know a lot of libertarians will say, well, that is the consequence of free choices. That is the consequence of people buying and selling labor on an open market. And so long as there isn't any government coercion in that relationship, we shouldn't be so concerned about it. But what I'm arguing is that conservatives should be concerned about it. We should be concerned that our economy is geared more towards the development of applications than curing terrible diseases. And we should care about a whole host of public goods in addition to that, and actually be willing to use politics and political power to accomplish some of those public goods. Now, I want to tell a story, one of the most heartbreaking stories I've heard since my book came out. It was a woman I met in southeastern Ohio, which is really ground zero for the opioid problem and so many of the other social problems that all of us care about in this country. And she was telling me about a young kid she had, a young patient who had become addicted to opioids. He was 8 years old, and he was already addicted to Percocets. And the way that this kid became addicted to opioids is that he would do drug runs for his family. He would sometimes do delivery runs for his family who were drug addicts and sometimes bought and sold on the side. And because they didn't have a whole lot of money, if he made a successful drug run, they would actually give him a Percocet as a reward. That was how this kid, at the tender age of 8, became addicted to opioids. Now, I think there's a tendency in our politics on the right to look at this kid and say, you know, it's a tragedy what's happened to him, but it's fundamentally a tragedy that political power can't touch. His parents need to make better decisions. This child, God willing, needs to make better decisions when he grows up. But I think that ignores the way in which human beings actually live their lives, the cultural and economic and environmental context in which this kid grows up. It ignores the fact that, for example, this kid lives in a community that has too few spare dollars to spend on a kid, but has too many spare opioids. That is a political problem. That is something that we decided to do using political power. We allowed commercial actors to sell these drugs into our communities. We allowed our regulatory state to do and approve these drugs and to do nothing when it was very clear that these substances were starting to affect our own communities. That was a political choice, and political power can actually fix it.
Basically, what he's saying, it's nice to see him acknowledging the opioid crisis, right? This was back in 2019. Okay. It's nice to see him recognize the opioid crisis. But how is he using that? He's using it as an example of the result in these families, particular families, a result of individual actors, of individual freedom. This is what basically he's laying it on the individual. And that government money, more government power can fix it. That's where he's coming from. I mean, and the other thing too is I got another piece here that I wanted to show you.
Now, I think that the question conservatives confront at this key moment is this: whom do we serve? Do we serve pure, unfettered commercial freedom? Do we serve commerce at the expense of the public good? Or do we serve something higher? And are we willing to use political power to actually accomplish those things? And my answer is simple. I serve my child. And it has become abundantly clear that I cannot serve two masters. I cannot defend commerce when it's used to addict his toddler brain to screens, and it will be used to addict his adolescent brain to pornography. I cannot defend the rights of drug companies to sell poison to his neighbors without any consequence because those people chose to take those drugs.
Again, freedom of the individual leads to people taking the drugs, right? Right?
It is time, as Ronald Reagan once said, for choosing. And I choose my son. I choose the civic constitution necessary to support and sustain a good life for him. And I choose a healthy American constitution necessary. And I choose my son. I choose the civic constitution necessary to support and sustain a good life for him. And I
choose a civic constitution to support and sustain a good life.
Choose a healthy American nation so necessary to defend and support that civic constitution. Thank you so much. American nation necessary to, and I choose my son. I choose the civic constitution necessary to support and sustain a good life for him. And I choose a healthy American nation so necessary to defend and support that civic constitution. Thank you so much.
Do you think that was the oath that he swore when he went in to be vice president? A civic constitution necessary to support and sustain, well, his son's life in particular, but, right? But, and he chooses a nation, the nation necessary to support that civic constitution, not our constitution, not our founding constitution, but a civic constitution that will support and sustain people, his son in particular. And he chooses the nation necessary to support that civic constitution, which is definitely not our founding constitution. But then he goes and swears an oath to the Constitution, I think, as the vice president, right? There's one more I wanted to point out to you here. Peter Thiel. He spoke at the 2019, okay? And I've got 3104 to the end.
And it'd be nice if the left were able to participate, but they have to get over that issue, and don't see that happening anytime soon. Now, I do think there's also been something on the right that's distracted us from having these kinds of conversations in the United States, and the single thing I would zero in on the right that's distracted us from this over the last few decades is the doctrine of American exceptionalism. This doctrine that the United States is exceptionally different, not commensurate with any other country, can't be compared, and it's one that sort of has, maybe was sort of incarnated in the sort of insanities of the millenarian Bush 43 second inaugural.
American exceptionalism. Oh, the progressive left has hated that whole term about American exceptionalism. Now, this guy who's a nationalist, populist, right guy is also shitting on American exceptionalism. But why was American exceptional? It wasn't because American was exceptional in the world because America was free. It was our freedom. It was our liberty. It was our free enterprise. It was our, right? That was what made America exceptional in the world. That's why we've got a Statue of Liberty here that is stepping off our shores, not so much to welcome all the downtrodden and the rejects of the world, right? Everybody that rejected, kicked everybody out of their country for whatever reason. They rejected them, and they sent them to America. I mean, Load up America with all these people. We welcomed them. But that's not what the Statue of Liberty was actually for. It was a gift because let the liberty of America, let the Statue of Liberty carrying the torch from the liberty of America as founded, the idea of America, to the world. Let the world be as free as America, and the world can be as exceptional, not because we weren't exceptional because we were Americans, we were exceptional because we were free. He's shitting on that exceptionalism. He's also shitting on the individual liberty. All these guys, nationalists, are doing. But listen.
The exceptionalism obscured everything. If you want sort of a theological or epistemological analog, I think it is roughly similar to the problem of what one can know about the God of the Old Testament or the God of the Quran. If God is radically singular, radically different, can you know anything about him? It's the same as the medieval problem of the attributes of God. And if you sort of think of the United States as so exceptional that we can never talk about it, that is going to obscure and obfuscate a lot of the kinds of questions that I've been discussing today. What I think has happened in practice is that exceptionalism, the doctrine of exceptionalism, has led to a country that's exceptionally overweight, that's exceptionally addicted to opioids, that has an exceptionally dysfunctional public infrastructure where it costs 10 times as much to build a mile of subway as it does in socialist Western Europe, that is, in short, exceptionally unself-aware, exceptionally unself-critical. And what I think we should always underscore.
Exceptionally unself-critical. I guess the critical theory and critical race theory of cultural Marxism is helping to remedy that situation, right?
On the nationalist side for the United States is that nationalism has nothing to do with this sort of exceptional unself-awareness. That nationalism is not, it's not blind patriotism, it's not my country right or wrong, without any questions. Nationalism is going to be is going to ask hard questions. It's going to ask, how does our country stack up against other countries? How does it compare? And it may find it very wanting. It's going to be extremely critical. It's not going to be unreflective. I think that on the, and I think the, I think whatever else the Trump presidency stands for, it stands for, a move beyond exceptionalism, beyond those dogmas. They are not coming back on the Republican side. They are over. It is long past time for us to grow out of exceptionalism, and I think we should settle for greatness. Thank you very much.
How is that any different than the left? How is that any different than the leftist progressives? It's the same thing, same collectivism. Listen to this question. Listen to his answer.
Do you see any opportunities for a convergence between national conservatives and anybody on the left? Any kind of social democratic criticism of libertarianism or something?
I think there are. Look, I think all the questions that I've identified are ones that in theory could also be tackled by the left. There are some difficult questions about big tech, difficult questions about the nature of the free trade regime. About theory could all the questions that I've identified are ones that in theory could also be tackled by the left.
In his own words.
There are some. look, I think all the questions that I've identified are ones that that in theory could also be tackled by the left. There are some difficult questions about big tech, difficult questions about the nature of the free trade regime. Warren and Sanders have talked about the runaway debt problem. They want to socialize it. Whereas I think I want to stick the colleges with the bill. And so I think on all these issues, there's in theory there should be some ability to work across party lines. I think that I do think one of the challenges for the left is they are captured by the institutions, and the institutions in our country are corrupt and sociopathic, and that's why if part of the critique of universities is a critique of the corruption of the Studio 54 Harvard nightclub, that's one that's existentially tough for Elizabeth Warren to do. I'd welcome her doing it, but I'm not holding my breath.
Yeah, there was something there. I can't. But anyways, there you have it in his own words, right? I got another thing really quick. Hayek wrote, Hayek gets mentioned in here a few times. And Hayek wrote, this article, why I'm not a conservative, why he wasn't a conservative. And I myself, I can't call myself a conservative. There are people out there, David Leitch is one of them. He's animately defending conservatism according to what our founding principles are. And, however, I can't see myself as a conservative. I can't see myself as a conservative for the same reason that Hayek espouses in this article here. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm just going to read a paragraph of this so you can get an idea where he's coming from. Again, that's the article. But he writes in here, let me now state that what seems to... I'm going to get a little bit bigger so I can see it here. Let me now state what seems to me the decisive objection to any conservatism which deserves to be called such is that by its very nature it cannot offer an alternative to the direction in which things are moving, in which we are moving. So as progressive collectivism incrementally moves away, and all things that are progressive, as they progress from our founding principles and founding republic towards a full-blown, centralized, centrally planned collectivist state or collective, okay, conservatism must go in that direction. So no matter how far towards that full-blown collectivist state or how far away from, you can only be conservative here, then you're conservative here, then you're conservative here, until a conservative eventually becomes anything less than the full-blown collectivist world socialist state, that the ultimate end of collectivism, the world socialism, the ultimate end of collectivism is basically, in collectivist doctrine, is the single global humanity as a single global human organism with one queen, right? Or a single global human hive with one queen, like a giant ant colony or beehive, right? So a conservative can be anything in between that and where we are today, or even our founding principles. It's a constant concession over time to the collectivism that it's trying to hold back and be conservative to. Like I said before, conservatives to progressives, full-blown progressives today, like when Trump becomes president after years of all this, Obama and Clintons and all these things out there, right? A full-blown collectivist expansion of lefty mindset in politics, right? Everything, right? Now all of a sudden you got Trump. He comes in as a populist nationalist, and the lefty progressives are like, oh my God, now we're the conservatives. And articles were written to such that now the progressives were the true conservatives trying to conserve all the progressive progress that had been made. You see what I'm saying? So I can't see where I'm a conservative there either. But like he's saying, it is by its very nature, it cannot offer the alternative to the direction in which we are moving. It may succeed by its resistance to current tendencies and slowing down undesirable developments, but since it does not indicate another direction, it cannot prevent their it cannot prevent their continuance. It cannot prevent their continuance. It has, for this reason, invariably been the fate of conservatism to be dragged along a path not of its own choosing. Yeah? The tug of war between conservatives and progressives can only affect the speed, not the direction of the contemporary developments. But hey, you can't let perfect be the enemy of good, right? Don't let perfect be the enemy of good, man. Keep that conservatism within the argument of the conservatism as it evolves within the progressivism it claims to be pushing or holding back against. The tug of war between conservatives and progressives can only affect the speed, not the direction of the progress, quote unquote. I personally cannot be content with simply helping to apply the brakes. What the liberal must ask, the liberal here in Hayek's context would be the libertarian, the individual liberty guy, right? Me, maybe. Must ask, first of all, is not how fast or how far we should move, but where we should move. In fact, he differs much, much more from the collectivist radical of today than does the conservative. That's where I'm at. I'm trying to uphold the founding principles. Conservatives today are shitting on our founding principles. Be they leftist or progressive populist right. Both of them. Right? In fact, he differs much, much more from the collectivist radical of today than does the conservative. While the last generally holds merely a mild and moderate version of the prejudices of his time, the liberal today must more positively oppose some of the basic conceptions which most conservatives share with socialists today. And this is where I'm coming from. This is where conservatism has come. And there was another thing here I could show you. I wanted to kind of go over this really quick with you. Let me see if I can get this up for you. Okay. Wanted to kind of go over some of this stuff really quick for you. This whole national populist right, this whole national conservative thing, and I've gone over this in another show before, but I just want to touch on it really quick. It's not a phenomenon that's American specifically. It's a geopolitical movement. This was written in 2015. This guy Anton Chekhov, I don't know how you say his name. But anyway, this was written back in 2015, and he's warning in this article about the Russian a world national socialist movement. Okay, that they were putting together, that Russia was putting together, Moscow was forming. A number of internal documents passed to me by Moscow-based provided an insight to the agenda and structure of the World National Socialist Movement. Driving force behind the movement in the St. Petersburg branch of extreme right Rodina, the Russian Imperial Movement. Rodina was founded in 2003, and one of its co-founders were Vice President Minister Dmitry Rogozin. Prominent people in the Russian government, right? The manifesto of the movement claims that the world is governed by an ideology of liberalism, okay? Multicultural, which now includes not only the liberalism of capitalism, it includes the liberalism of the world socialist communists, the globalists of the communists. They're now somehow both the same liberalism, according to the doctrine of fascist nationalist right in Europe and Russia. You know, like Alexander Dugin's shit too, right? So the manifesto of the movement claims that the world is governed by an ideology of liberalism, multiculturalism, and tolerance, which is, I don't know. This is the view of the activists. In view of the activists, result in the erosion of nations, massive migration in countries with foreign civilizational basis, falling away from religion, replacement of spirituality and materialism, impoverishment of culture, destruction of the family, and healthy moral values, which is all the same shit these guys are all talking about, all these at this National Conservative Conference, right? All the same shit. Furthermore, the manifesto refers to the supranational institutions such as European Union and NATO, and argues that these forces represent the global cabal, which is in Russian cultural discourse is essentially a euphemistic reference to the global Jewish conspiracy. You got to remember LaRouche, Lyndon LaRouche and LaRouche Pack, and the whole LaRouche cult idea comes out of the same new left that the neoconservatives did, the same new left that the Weather Underground did, right? And they're all about that Jewish conspiracy, London-based Jewish conspiracy, whatever, right? So you've got all those people that are pushing that LaRouchian conspiracy theory shit today. You know, Matthew Ert and, you know, all his comrades, right? But, yeah. The World National Conservative Movement aims to counter liberalism and globalization by staging a conservative revolution and bringing far-right parties to power in Western societies. The manifesto claims that a victory of the conservative revolution, even in one country, will provide an example of other countries establishing a world conservative movement is considered the first step in this direction. Yeah. And this was in 2015, right about the same time Bannon was starting his national there's Bannon right there. Bannon was supposed to be a speaker at the National 2024 National Conservative. Yeah. Joined Steve Bannon as headline speaker. I don't know. Confirmed speakers for the U.S. National Conservative Conference website alongside Steve Bannon. These were other people that were supposed to be Bannon. I don't know if it's because he went to jail or what, but I wanted to bring in kind of Bannon kind of fits into this thing because right about the same time he was pushing his he went and took over the Tea Party and broke up the Tea Party from within side too. Steve Bannon did with his nationalism, and the Tea Party's kind of still oriented, founding principles oriented conservatism, right? Steve Bannon went and made sure that got broke up. LaRouche Pack also had a big deal to do with breaking up the Tea Party too, along the same, because his, I don't know, kind of convoluted nationalism, proto-fascism or whatever they called it, you know what I mean? They all worked together to destroy the actual and real movement that the Tea Party could have actually represented until the nationalists went in there and broke it all up, including Steve Bannon. As a matter of fact, that whole Moscow-driven world national conservative movement from which the America's national conservative movement and conference was a result of, or part and parcel to. Steve Bannon was huge in both, right? And you got to see here, Russia's alt-right, Rasputin, says that he's Steve Bannon's ideological soulmate. Alexander Dugin said he was Steve Bannon's ideological soulmate, right? And there's a couple things I'm just wanting to point out here kind of quick on this, is that that's an article that came out of the piece. And Steve Bannon, the other thing I wanted to point out about him is that you can see this back in 2018, 2017, 2018. He was traveling all over Europe trying to gel trying to gel together a unified nationalist right in Europe. You've got this Bannon plan for Europe-wide populist supergroup sparks alarm. Of course, over in Europe, you've got, people are leery of national socialism, but in Europe, the only right and left they have over there is the communist left and the national socialist right. And now that has been brought home to America, thanks in part to, large part to Steve Bannon, which he's not afraid to come out and say that's what he's all about. Let me see. We got just a few. It's one thing for us to say, but here's Europe. Out of Eurotopics.net, okay. Right-wing extremist Bannon targeting EU elections. Dangerous symptoms of weakness. European nationalism. The nationalists in Europe were, this guy's saying, is irreconcilable. He's going to have a hard time getting them all to come together. Of course, Southern Poverty Law Center, they hate anybody who's not a full-blown communist or anarchist. Human rights first. Bannon appointment undermines U.S. global leadership on human rights. Yeah, well, human rights are world socialism, communism. Bannon represents the socialism of nationalism, so they are in contention, yes. They are in contention. So I just wanted to kind of show you some of that. And there's an article here that you can read. It kind of goes along with that earlier show that I did. This guy, Stanley Aronowitz, or whatever, is a full-blown, essentially, I don't know, he's a full-blown Marxist. But when you're reading about the Marxist, Trotskyist origins of the neoconservative right, who better to tell you what going back to what that Marxist communist DNA in today's new right. It's everywhere. Who better to explain it than a Marxist historian? And I'm telling you, he does. It's crazy. But I lay out some different evidence to that in that last video, that one of the first videos I did, deciphering the collectivism of the progressive right. But there's that and then kind of the Fascist International, why Steve Bannon's 2018 meeting with Alexander Dugin still matters. Now, this guy actually met. Bannon and Dugin actually met. So, and that was in, I think, 2018? Was that in 2018? I don't know. But, Dugin hates America. Remember when he put that video out when Trump was running back in 2015 or 2016? He put out a video, "In Trump we trust." I can't find it anywhere. I looked to see if I could find it. It's gone from the internet. "In Trump we trust." That's what it's, Alexander Dugin. It's gone. I couldn't find it. But anyways, Evola, it gets into these different Heidegger and the Steve Bannon's and traditionalism, the common traditionalism held between Bannon and Alexander Dugin. It gets into the common ancestry as far as philosophers go, and the philosophers from which they follow is Heidegger and this guy Evola, who both basically essentially Heidegger's violent revolution, Evola's basically a pro-Nazi guy, okay? And but that's an article that kind of points these things out, even though Dugan still hates America. Bannon tries to convince him that the real America, the nationalist America, is Russia's friend, is Dugan's friend, and China is our common enemy, which is because they're globalist, communist. I don't know, but that's a good article to kind of get on, get some more. But that's where I'm going with some of the stuff I wanted to point out. The thing that I'm trying to get to is that it's all tied together. The common ancestry of the collectivism on the right, whether it's National Socialist or Trotsky Socialist, it's all together. It's all together. This national populist, national socialist right in America. And when you look at the right today, and the whole concept, when you look at the right today, it's a long history and a wellspring of collectivists that go back to, the neoconservatives emerging out of the Trotskyist new left, as did the Weather Underground, as did Lyndon LaRoche, and the LaRoche cult emerged out of that same new left. The neoconservatives emerged out of that same new left. The Trotskyism on the left, and then now you've got the socialism on the right of Steve Bannon. It's all the same socialist collectivist DNA and hard left DNA, collectivist DNA, combined with, right-wing collectivist DNA that the whole collectivist that makes up the whole collectivist DNA of the new right in America today. In the world, right? That's who we have defending. That's who we have defending. That's all that stands between America and a full-blown communist state is the National Socialism and combined Trotskyist communist DNA of the right. Just wanted to point these things out. Again, I hope you got something out of it. I know there's a lot to go through here, but I went through a lot of this a little bit more in that other show, like I said, that I mentioned earlier about the progressive. I get into the neocons a little bit more in that show. But Minnie P, I got to take Minnie P out. So she's ready to go. She's had enough of this shit. I hope you enjoyed the daffodils that we got today for the show, because the daffodils just started blooming in the past couple days. Spring is here. And that's one of the reasons why it's been so long since I put my last show up. I've been busy at the nurseries, my landscaping, nursery time, digging trees out in the field, pruning trees, pruning the roots of trees. It's getting kind of crazy, which is good, right? Long winter's nap. But I'm still going to try and put some shows out to you. I got some other shows that are in the process of being made. And one of the next shows that I'm going to be getting to is I got an email from the Brownstone Institute. And I'm going to be going over the full-blown collectivism, human rights advocacy of the full-blown progressive collectivism of the Brownstone Institute as a fake movement. If you want to think that they're trying to preserve anything to do with our founding principles, anything to do with our founding republic. If that's what you're getting out of what the Brownstone Institute is, I think you're going to be in for a rude awakening. I've already done a couple shows on the Brownstone Institute and the human rights advocacy of the Brownstone Institute. I'm going to get into it because they're still pushing the same shit today. But thank you for stopping by The Liberty Perspective. I'm Joe Marshall, and see you next time.